June 22, 1941. As dawn broke across the western frontier of the Soviet Union, the world witnessed the beginning of the largest invasion in human history, Operation Barbarossa. 3 million German soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks, aircraft, and artillery pieces, surged forward in a surprise attack against the Soviet Union. It was not just an invasion, it was the collision of two empires, two ideologies, and two men who despised one another, Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin. This was not merely another chapter in World War II. This was the campaign that would determine its outcome. Barbarossa was meant to be swift, decisive, and final. Instead, it unleashed a war of attrition that would grind millions into dust and turn the tide of global history. The seeds of conflict, the seeds of Operation Barbarossa, were sown long before 1941. Adolf Hitler's obsession with Lebensraum, the idea that Germany needed living space in the East, made conflict with the Soviet Union inevitable. In his mind, Eastern Europe was to be conquered, its populations enslaved or eliminated, and its vast resources exploited to sustain a German empire. Despite signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939, a temporary non-aggression agreement with Stalin, Hitler never abandoned his dream of crushing Bolshevism. To him, the Soviet Union was both a racial enemy and an ideological foe. By late 1940, after the fall of France, Hitler turned his gaze eastward. Britain had not surrendered, but he believed defeating the Soviets would give him the resources and power to force London to its knees. Stalin, for his part, distrusted Hitler, but believed the pact would buy time to rebuild the Red Army, which had been gutted by his own purges. Both men knew war was coming, only the timing remained uncertain. Planning the invasion. The plan for Operation Barbarossa was ambitious, bordering on reckless. Germany divided its forces into three massive army groups. Army Group North was tasked with striking through the Baltics toward Leningrad. Army Group Center, the most powerful, would drive toward Moscow. Army Group South aimed at Ukraine, the breadbasket of Europe, with its fertile soil and vital resources. The strategy relied on speed, Blitzkrieg on an unprecedented scale. Hitler and his generals believed the Soviet Union was a rotten structure that would collapse with one hard blow. They expected the campaign to last only a few months, with victory secured before the winter of 1941. But beneath the confidence lay flaws. The German military underestimated Soviet manpower, industrial capacity, and sheer resilience. Intelligence failures blinded them to the depth of Soviet defenses. They had prepared for a sprint, but instead they were walking into a marathon. The invasion begins. At 3:15 in the morning on June 22, 1941, the German guns opened fire. A storm of artillery shells thundered across the frontier, followed by waves of aircraft targeting Soviet airfields. Within hours, the Luftwaffe destroyed hundreds of Soviet planes on the ground, establishing air superiority. The Wehrmacht poured across the border. The Red Army, caught by surprise despite warnings, reeled under the assault. Stalin, stunned by the betrayal, initially refused to believe the reports, convinced it was a provocation by rogue German units. By the time reality set in, entire Soviet armies were being encircled. The largest land invasion in history was underway, stretching across an 1,800-mile front. Initial German successes. The early weeks of Barbarossa were catastrophic for the Soviets. The speed and coordination of the German advance were overwhelming. At Minsk, Smolensk, and Uman, entire Soviet armies were surrounded and destroyed. By the end of the summer, millions of Soviet soldiers had been captured. The Germans advanced hundreds of miles into Soviet territory, seizing vast swaths of land. Town after town fell. Stalin's purges of the 1930s had decapitated the Red Army's leadership, leaving it unprepared for such a storm. German soldiers, convinced of their superiority, began to believe victory was inevitable. But beneath the surface, cracks were already forming. Soviet resistance, though chaotic, was stiffening. Partisan warfare was beginning behind German lines. And crucially, the further the Wehrmacht advanced, the longer and thinner its supply lines became. The Soviet response. For days after the invasion, Stalin seemed paralyzed. But by July, he emerged to rally his people. Brothers and sisters, he declared in a famous radio address, calling on the Soviet people to fight not just for survival, but for the very existence of their nation. Factories were dismantled and moved east, beyond the reach of German bombers. Millions of civilians were mobilized into the war effort. Propaganda framed the struggle as the Great Patriotic War. Slowly, the Red Army began to regroup, trading space for time, wearing down the invaders with relentless defense. The Soviets suffered staggering losses, but their capacity for endurance was unmatched. Every village became a battlefield, every river a line of defense. The Germans had expected collapse. What they found was defiance. The greatest enemy of the German advance was not always the Red Army. It was Russia itself. The vast distances devoured fuel and supplies. German trucks broke down on primitive roads, while the Soviet railways, built on a different gauge, had to be converted before they could be used. Food and ammunition became scarce. Soldiers often relied on captured supplies, plundering villages as they advanced. The campaign that was supposed to end quickly dragged on, and with every mile gained, Germany's strength was stretched thinner. The summer heat gave way to autumn rains, turning the roads into seas of mud. Progress slowed, morale dropped, and the clock was ticking toward winter. While Moscow was the symbolic prize, Hitler and his generals turned south to Ukraine in the summer of 1941. The fertile farmlands, coal, and oil fields of the region were vital for Germany's long-term plans. What followed was the Battle of Kiev, one of the greatest encirclements in history. German forces trapped nearly 600,000 Soviet soldiers in a vast pocket. It was a devastating blow, an entire Soviet front obliterated. But this triumph came at a cost. The diversion south delayed the advance toward Moscow by critical weeks, pushing the decisive assault closer to the dreaded Russian winter. The Germans celebrated Kiev as a victory of epic proportions, but strategically, it was a poisoned chalice. Time was slipping away. By September, Hitler's gaze shifted to Moscow. Operation Typhoon, the offensive to capture the Soviet capital, was launched. At first, it seemed unstoppable. Another series of encirclements trapped hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops. German forces came within sight of Moscow's outskirts, but the Soviets refused to surrender. Reinforcements, including fresh Siberian divisions hardened by winter, arrived just in time. The weather turned. Temperatures plunged below -30°C. German soldiers, dressed in thin summer uniforms, froze in their trenches. Weapons jammed, fuel froze, and frostbite spread like wildfire. In December, the Red Army launched a massive counter-offensive. The Germans, for the first time in the war, were forced into retreat. Moscow had been saved. Barbarossa had failed. While Moscow was under threat, another tragedy unfolded in the north. In September 1941, German forces reached the outskirts of Leningrad. Instead of storming the city, Hitler ordered a siege. What followed was one of the longest and most brutal blockades in history, lasting nearly 900 days. Civilians endured starvation, bombardment, and freezing winters. People boiled wallpaper for glue, ate pets, and even resorted to cannibalism to survive. Over 1 million lives were lost, yet Leningrad never surrendered. The siege tied down German forces, drained resources, and became a symbol of Soviet resilience. Even as the city starved, its spirit endured. The human cost of Barbarossa was almost beyond comprehension. Civilians were caught in the maelstrom of war, subjected to atrocities, mass executions, and starvation. Entire villages were burned in reprisals. The Holocaust expanded eastward as Einsatzgruppen followed the army, carrying out mass shootings of Jews, communists, and other targeted groups. On the battlefield, losses were staggering. By the end of 1941, the Soviets had lost millions of men, dead, wounded, or captured. The Germans, too, suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties. The dream of a swift victory turned into a nightmare of endless sacrifice. Operation Barbarossa was the turning point of World War II. Hitler had gambled everything on a quick conquest, and he failed. The Wehrmacht, once considered invincible, had been stopped. The Soviet Union, though battered and bleeding, had not collapsed. It was rising stronger than ever. The failure of Barbarossa doomed Nazi Germany to a two-front war it could never win. From this point onward, the Eastern Front would become the decisive theater of the war, consuming men and resources in battles of unimaginable scale. Barbarossa was more than a military operation. It was the moment when the fate of Europe shifted. What was meant to be a swift victory became the beginning of Germany's downfall. Operation Barbarossa was not just a campaign, it was a catastrophe that consumed millions, reshaped nations, and determined the outcome of the Second World War. It showed the danger of hubris, the resilience resilience of nations, and the immense cost of global conflict. History is not just dates and battles, it is the lived experience of those who endured it. And in Barbarossa, humanity saw both its darkest brutality and its fiercest determination. If you found this story as compelling as we did, make sure to subscribe to Erahive, where history speaks, and join us again as we bring history's defining moments to life.